The next step is to create a login page where the user can go and get authenticated. I'm going to do this inside ASP.NET MVC, so the first thing I need is a model for my view. But before I can create my model, I need a place to put it. So I'm going to go ahead and add a folder, and I'm going to call it models. Inside that models folder, I'm going to go and add another class, and I'm going to name it login model. As this model is going to be used for a login form, it needs two properties. The first one is going to be a string called username, and the second one is also going to be a string and is going to be called password. So now that we have a model for our view, the next step is to create a new controller. In this case, I'm going to create an empty MVC5 controller, and I'm going to name it auth. As you might remember, the path to the login page was /auth/login. So inside my auth controller, I need an action called login. And inside of this action, I need to create a model. In this case, a new instance of login model, which I then pass on to the view. And with that in place, it's time to focus on the actual view. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new view under the auth folder, and I'm going to call it login. And then I'm going to make sure it's not a partial view and it doesn't use a layout page. And once again, I need to remember to add that inherits for system.web.mvc.webView page. But in this case, I'm going to use the generic version and tell it that I'm using a pluralsight.owin.demo.models.login model as the model. But in this case, I also need to remember to add a using statement for system.web.mvc.html. The reason for that is that I'll be using some extension methods on the HTML object, which are located in that namespace. And once again, this is just because I added MVC as a NuGet package and never got the web config settings that I needed. If you start off with a project using a proper template, you won't need this. So we now have a view for our login page, but it's still pretty empty. So what I need to do in here is add another login form. So I'm just going to create a new form in here and add a username and a password input and a submit button. Like that. With the view in place, I'm going to head back to the auth controller and add another action to handle the post that it will generate. And since the signature is going to be pretty much the same, I'm just going to copy the existing action and adorn it with the HTTP post attribute. And since it's going to handle posted values, I'm going to add a login model parameter to my action. With that in place, I can go ahead and add the functionality that I need inside of my action. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and check if model.username is equal to Chris, ignoring case, and if model.password is equal to password. So that is definitely not the way that you should be doing authentication control, but for this demo it will just have to do. So if this check is okay, I guess I am Chris, and if not, I'm just going to return the same view again and have them try once more. So what happens if I do pass the check? Well, we need to create some form of object that represents the user that just logged in. That means creating a new instance of a class called claimsIdentity, which is available in the namespace system.security.claims. This class has a whole heap of constructor overloads, but the one that I want to use is the one that takes a single string parameter called authentication type. And if you remember, when we configure the cookie authentication middleware, we set a property called authentication type. These two need to correspond for this to work. So in this case, that means passing in the value application cookie. Next, we need to add some claims to our identity. In this case, I'm going to add a claim with the name identifier type and set the value to model.username. And then I'm going to create another claim for the name type and set it to the same value. With this in place, I can go ahead and sign in the user. With Project Katana, I do this by writing http context.getOWIN context. This gives me access to the IOWIN context that we've seen inside of the middlewares, but inside of an MVC controller. I can then use the OWIN context authentication property to sign in the user by calling signin and passing in the identity we just created. That's all there is to it. So let's try and press F5 and see what happens. So the default route seems to be working because we're getting the hello from MVC. So let's head over to /secret. And yeah, that redirects us to auth/login. and gives us the login form. So let's just fill out the login form and see what happens. Okay, so that was definitely not what was supposed to happen. So the reason for this yellow screen of death is that Nancy unfortunately happens to touch some stuff internally that causes ASP.NET MVC to fail. So the simplest solution to that in this case is just to remap Nancy instead of using the pass through when status codes are method. Okay, so that should solve that problem. Let's just press F5 and see if it works now. Okay, hello world from MVC as we expect, so let's head over to secrets. And that gives us the form as we expect, so let's just fill that out. And there it is. It says this is secret, and that means that we're now authenticated.